Hello and welcome to my tutorial on texturing and shading in Blender 2.5. So today our example is going to be a shoulder pad on Cinto, which this particular one wasn't actually in the film. Just thought I'd make another one for the sake of it. So first step is to unwrap it so that we can apply some more interesting textures. So select the object, tab into edit mode. I've modelled it in such a way where the seam can just go on an edge and be continuous. So Alt right click to select an edge loop. Control E brings up the edges menu and mark a seam. So that much is pretty straightforward so far. So we bring up in another window the UV editing section. Now if you've made a render, it'll put that image in there by default, so just kill that out. Go into edit mode again, select all the faces and just U to unwrap. And there we go. In many cases this will be enough, depending on how fussy you are about the mapping and whether the object is going to get particularly close to the camera. Some things you'll notice, just a trick here, I usually like to have at least one central line or something pretty key just aligned, because then if you select everything and hit E to unwrap in this view, it'll just help make it more symmetrical. Just moving them around. You'll notice around the edges that some are much thicker than they should be. Particularly the last 6 or so loops around the edge there are quite wide. This particular object probably wouldn't get too close to camera most of the time, so I'm just going to leave it as is for the purpose of this tutorial. But you can go in there and just manually scale those points a bit closer together because they don't take up that much actual texture space. So from here I usually bake an AO map, Ambient Occlusion map of the texture. UV layouts are fine to export, but might not give that much detail on what the front face is, what the back faces are, how much things are going to show up, and also what's raised and what isn't, because generally speaking you'd put more dirt in the crevices and rubbed off more detail where it's been worn on the outer. So I've set my baking settings, good to go with a new image. Click bake. Doesn't seem like anything's happening here. We're not really getting any response out of Blender. Of course, things aren't locked off as much as they used to be, so it's still possible to rotate around while it's rendering, and there we go, we've got our first crash of the day. So I'll just restart Blender. New image again to bake to. Scroll, 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 scroll. Just put the settings in again because I forgot to save before doing a new thing, which is always handy. A lot of Control S. There we go. Still nothing. Still no response. Now I have this on Approximate Ambient Occlusion, so it really shouldn't be taking too long as to why I'm getting a bit confused. Start Blender again, open the file again, edit mode again. Right, this time we'll try something a bit more straightforward, just in case Blender's having some serious issues. It helps to do a bit of troubleshooting with 2.5 because it's 2.5, which means certain things should be working, but certain things can get overlooked. So we'll just go through the different settings. That doesn't look too bad. But yeah, the more you can simplify things and figure out whether it's user error or not will help with making bug reports, and bug reports help with making Blender. Still nothing. Impatience getting the better of me. Still nothing, and there we go. This brings us to part 2, the bug tracker. Now, you need to create a username and log in for the bug tracker. Not entirely sure what reason, but please go ahead and do so. I'm needing to make a bit more effort myself to use it, but it'll be worth it in the long run when 2.5 starts crashing so often. So, if you start browsing through the various sections, if you've got a bug, obviously you need to try and report it, and it's great so it can get fixed, but it pays to look through the current bugs in the tracker just to make sure you're not making a duplicate, because that makes everyone's life easier, and the developers can sort through them a bit quicker. Now, in sorting through, when recording, I missed that the bug that's probably mine is still there, so I didn't actually report it anyway. So fortunately we don't have a duplicate bug report. Just checking a couple of other bugs while I was here. No, they're not related to what I'm doing and shouldn't hinder the rest of the tutorial. Now, getting back to it, I've found, thanks to my brother for the use of this machine, and we'll continue on. The trick is to just wait out. I've got the subdivision settings on the object probably a little bit high, but it helps avoid the artifacts you get with the different circles and just odd shapes coming up with the approximate ambient occlusion. Of course, you can use ray traced ambient occlusion as well to bake these maps. That might be preferable, seeing as you're baking them anyway. Depends on the quality of your machine and your patience, really. Now, if this pad was going to come off of her shoulder at any point during whatever you're planning to do with it in an animation, then you would want to get the object and bake it without Sintel's shoulder underneath it, because as you can see, it bakes really dark shadow onto the ambient occlusion map. Now, if it's going to stay there the whole time, that's fine, because that dark patch will know that you don't really need to pay any attention whatsoever to texturing that part of the object, because it's not going to get seen. So once you've baked your map, save a copy. Save as will retain a copy or a link to the image in the blend file. Save a copy was added so that it would stop the garbage collector just collecting a link to every image that appears in that UV image window, which also works for renders. Otherwise, every test render you save for your files will end up in the blend file. So, now that we've got our baked image, we can go ahead and start painting our texture. Now, I'm using the Gimp, obviously, as you can see here. Several settings I don't quite like by default and often need to check that are working, particularly seeing as I'm using a different machine to what I usually do. So checking that my tablet is working and recognized, because it doesn't seem to do that too often by default. Now, I often like to start from a tileable texture, usually a 4K one, but just a smaller one for the purposes of this tutorial. It's just easy because if it's tileable, you can sort of just scale it in Blender to the sort of size that looks appropriate, bake it out, and then just start painting from there. Just a little bit of an issue with Gimp's layer system, but I'm sure I'll be able to figure that out. I'm just trying to get a copy of the ambient occlusion above the texture so I can mix the two together a bit and then start painting from there. So if we just do it manually instead of using the mouse, multiply, drop the opacity back a bit. Taking a bit long here, but yeah, that's the general idea. So from here, just take samples, control click while you're painting to just pick the color with the color picker, rather than changing tool every time you want to change a color. Just makes things a lot quicker and helps just get a good sample for the colors around your brush. So in the larger, flatter areas and the areas that are a bit raised, I'm just going to start by wearing away the texture detail, because that's where it'll be flattened and polished by just getting bumped and rubbed, and in the case of skin, you know, burnt by the sun and all that sort of thing. Just starting off with a much larger brush. Now you'll notice that I seem to put in more layers than I need to, and have more duplicate layers lying around. If you're the sort of person who likes to just merge everything down and paint all on the one layer, that's fine. It often forces you to make a bit bolder decisions, but whatever suits you, as long as you don't kill your computer with too many adjustment layers and all that sort of gear. So again, just testing the tablet for the moment that it actually is regarding pressure sensitivity properly. Seems to be, so we'll just move on. Anyway, so now, because there's some slight AO baked in and mixed with this texture, just able to easily pick up where the dirt and the grime is, because it'll build up in the crevices where things aren't as obvious to touch, and you know, like in real life, dirt just builds up in the corners. Very rough at this point. An alternative here, just realizing I don't need to paint under that because the strap's there. Instead of just painting straight on with the brush, you could have a separate layer that's a grime layer underneath the metal, another tileable texture perhaps, and then just erase through the metal so that it would come onto, you know, more textured image and not brush strokes. But just doing some manual painting for the moment. It's quite fun. Just painting a bit more wear on the edges, more specifically rubbing off detail where it'd be bumped against other things. This is, of course, sped up a little bit, not too much, because I wanted to keep it fairly close to real time. I think it's 1.5 time or something. Of course, that scratch there, not necessarily the best example, because it would sort of hit, unless it was a really, really deep gouge, sort of hit the top of that crossbar sort of thing and maybe scrape the edges, but it wouldn't generally go up along the side there, because unless it was a particularly weird shaped blade, it wouldn't hit the sides. So apologies for that not sterling example, but yeah, attention to detail is something that I seem to lack when doing that part. So again, just keeping it fairly rough for now. clean it up a bit more later. Now for the moment this is painting our diffuse or color texture, but we'll split these up into a couple of other textures later when we get to that point. So naming conventions are always good to keep in mind. It certainly helps to do that as you create a file rather than go back and rename and relink and etc. 40 or 50 different files at the end of a project. It's something that I'm trying to keep in mind as I work, specifically when I work in teams rather than my own work. In your own work, if you get a little sloppy with the naming conventions, it's not so bad. But when you've got 4 or 5 other people dealing with your files, you really need to get into a much better habit, at least better habit than I was before, for sorting out stuff like that. So again, just back to a slightly larger brush to quickly get a bit more low frequency detail in. For those who haven't heard the terms before, low frequency is sort of your larger, big dark or light areas, and your high frequency noise is your much smaller speckles and dots. And so the higher frequency, the smaller the detail, I guess, for whenever you hear those terms crop up in other tutorials. It's good to have a mix of low frequency and high frequency detail in your textures, because when you're zoomed out, the low frequency larger details are all you're really going to see, and vice versa, when you're zoomed in a lot, you're going to see the high frequency stuff. So if your texture was all high frequency noise, then when you're zoomed out to, I don't know, a full height view of Sintel, this would just look very grainy and not particularly interesting. So if you're working on a still image, of course you can have your detail in whatever sort of area you like, but if you're working on something that's going to be animated and moving and seen from different distances, a good mix of high frequency and low frequency noise helps keep things a bit more interesting. High frequency detail and low frequency detail noise is something you don't necessarily want. Still just chugging along with the manual painting, nearly getting towards the end of this stage. Now, of course you can see I'm doing a lot of the strokes quite roughly. You might want to take a bit more care at each stage, or you might be more like this workflow and just really rough to start with and then refine as you go. Being a bit quicker to start with, you can give clients, art directors, all that sort of higher ups something a bit more tangible to start with, which is always good. Saves them hopefully making too many changes later on if they can get a picture for what you're doing. So I've just made a darker, obviously redder version of the layer below. This just helps us get a bit of rust in without having to do too much more in the way of manual painting. because the detail is already in the tileable map that we copied it from. So, obviously the tileable doesn't work across UV seams, and I'm not going to worry about painting out the seams in this particular tutorial. But all the detail that we have to start with just makes texturing specific objects a whole lot quicker, rather than painting the detail in manually every time. And for personal projects that might be fun, but if you've got an entire suit of this armor to get done in a couple of days, then you're not going to want to manually paint in bits of rust on absolutely everything in every corner, just because you won't have the time. And if you did have the time, it could probably be a lot better spent on other objects, or making changes that suit the film or the project better. So again, we don't need to be phenomenally thorough with this, because it is just rust and dust and dirt here. We're not doing elaborate details on a jewel encrusted crown or something. We're just adding crustiness. Just enjoying Gimp's window management a bit there. Okay, now just doing a bit of clean-up work. Sometimes your heel brush will be more effective than others. Find in Gimp it's a bit buggy and a bit slow, so we're just going to use the clone tool a bit more, which isn't really as good, but depending on how you use it, it gets the job done. Righto, so the aim of what I'm doing here is to just remove anything that looks particularly obvious like a brush stroke, and just start to make it look more like the metallic surface it's supposed to be. Of course, if you're going for a more painterly style in your objects, then you'll sort of want to emphasize the brush strokes a bit more. Righto, that should pretty much do us for the painting of the main texture. Righto, so from the main color texture, we're going to make a reflective or diffuse texture that'll just control what parts of the mesh are more reflective than others. So, a couple of desaturation options, whatever gives the most detail. In the level setting, in programs that can use 16-bit images other than the Gimp, it's helpful to have that on when dealing with levels, as you just lose that bit less information. But the Gimp can only do 8-bit as far as I'm aware, so 8-bit it is. Right, well that was pretty straightforward. So from here, we're just going to make a bump texture, a bump map. The reason I've just got a bit of flat grey over the top is just to dial it down a bit and make sure there's no particular, sharp dents in or sharp dents out. Just evens it out a bit. Of course, if you were sculpting, you could bake these sorts of maps anyway, but if we're just painting, it's just a bit of a shortcut. Now, bump maps are much nicer in 2.5, but I still find that tangent space normal maps are better, and you can also push them further than the bump maps without getting aliasing errors, which is also quite handy, because when I was doing the test run for this tutorial, I was trying to use bumps, and yes, they're improved, but if you push them past 1, you get errors, and that makes sense because they're only meant to go up to 1. But if you bake it, you can bake it at whatever level you like, and it'll create a tangent space normal map that can go from 0 to 1 without problems, even though when you baked it, the bump map was on 4. So 4 might be a bit high. As you can see, it's quite sharp there. But we'll just dial that down a little bit. Bake again. Still quite sharp, but yeah, a bit more sensible than probably cranking it up that high. So we'll just save that out. Right, so obviously create new blank material. Remember to name these things like I was mentioning before with the textures. If you have a naming convention to stick to for the rest of the project, then obviously get into that. Now I've got diffuse intensity down to 0 and specular down to 0 because we're going to use maps to control these things anyway. So that makes it quite dark in the viewport. I was told by Ton during the project that the whole dvar value thing actually affects whether the texture goes from 1 onwards to affect it or from 0 onwards to affect it, but I'm used to not using it because I didn't know what it was, so we'll just put ref at 0. So we'll just load in the ref map, turn off use alpha, because if your image doesn't have an alpha, it screws up how the texture affects things, and in the case of a reflection map, wouldn't do anything at all. So with that off and reflection down to 0, taking a little while, but you can see already that it's darker in some parts than in others. And that's because even though there's no color map, different amounts of light are being reflected off the different parts because of that image texture there. So just fiddling the values a bit because I'm a bit fussy with this sort of thing. See if we can have it affect the ambient without it causing too many problems. And it causes problems. So I'll have to look into that more and report it later. As you can see there's a weirdness going on. Now keep in mind this isn't render branch, this is just regular trunk which I downloaded right before making the tutorial. So yeah, we'll just ignore the ambient for now until it's working again. Of course, if you really need the ambient working, then I encourage you to sort of look into things further and make reports yourselves. But for the purpose of getting on with this tutorial, we'll just leave it for now. Just doing another re-render a bit smaller This computer I'm on currently doesn't have as much grunt as I'm used to, even though it's approximate ambient occlusion. Yeah, it'll just make the rest of the shoot hopefully go a bit faster. Right, now that the base of the texture is underway, we'll add some colour in. Load the image. Turn off, use alpha, although for the colour map it's not so bad. But I get in the habit of turning that off every single time I load an image. Now we still want a little bit of white to shine through, so we're just not quite on 1 for the specular colour value. I've only got the single monitor up at the moment, so I can't really have my reference on the other monitor, so I'm just trying to remember what my settings were a bit before. It's starting to get there, but it's very dull as far as metal goes. Saving, because it's good to save your work, but also especially good because we're in 2.5, and as we've already seen in this tutorial, some things can go a little bit fuzzy. Right. Okay, now with the normal map, we need to tell Blender that it is a normal map, and specifically what type. Now, I've already turned off use alpha. Now I have got the normals set a bit high here, but having a normals on the normal map pushed over 1 doesn't seem to be quite as nasty as having a bump map pushed over 1, particularly with the anti-aliasing problems in when it's animated. It'll flicker less. So here we've got a fake reflection map, just as a bit of a gradient, something to keep it interesting. Of course you could use a image texture for this, or an environment map, or actual ray tracing, depending on what computing power you've got available, whether it's animated or not, as to whether you want to do it ray traced or not. But something simple as a gradient can work in a lot of cases. So just got it set to affect the diffuse amount for the moment. The other image ramp I had was as a stencil, so that there'd be a bit of a fall off between more reflective on the outer edge and less reflective facing the camera. Bit of a render test here shows that's already looking much nicer and much more metal-y than what we had without the gradient. Now I'll run through the compositing setup in a bit, but for the moment that's our render. So I don't see this as particularly complicated, but we've got the 2 render layers, one of them just being a render layer with only diffuse with the material override on. You can get to that in the render layers dialog. And the other one just being the straight beauty pass, or general render layer with everything else on it. So this box here is basically to get the diffuse pass and the shadow pass, work out where there is direct light and where there's just bounced light, So where there is direct light, you're not going to get ambient occlusion in, because ambient occlusion is only visible in the shadows, or at least it should be. So these nodes here basically just take the diffuse from the material override and the shadow, figure out what's in light, figure out what's in dark, and then you use that as a factor to multiply the ambient occlusion on. So a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but that's just keeps it nice. So I've got that node group, and I can just import that into other files, and only have to think about it the once. And of course, if you're working with an alpha, I just added one more node to, not affect the background. But that's really all that does. So there's the mask there, with the white being what's in shadow, and the darker it gets, the more it's in direct light from the lamp, as opposed to just general environment light from around. So this curve here, it's just because I like fiddling with colours, bit of glare to have the metal a bit more shiny where it's overexposed. And there's the final render. So that's my tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I hope you've learnt something from it.